Guys, please, okay, just listen. Would you believe me if I told you that I really, really, really want to be an art teacher? Now, would you also believe me if I told you that I've tried recording a tutorial like 5 different times, but I have no idea how to properly explain what I'm doing or how to stay on topic, and it just ends up being like 30 minutes of me rambling and making some of the most atrocious art I've ever made. Anyways, you guys are my test subjects, because if I can't even make a tutorial video, then how could I ever expect to actually teach in front of a classroom? So, shading. I'm gonna try explaining this as if you have no idea what shading even is. But if you aren't a beginner and just want a refresher on some tips, then this should still be helpful. Anyways, what's shading? And why is it important? You may have watched cartoons like Adventure Time or Steven Universe and thought, well, those art styles have little to no shading, so who cares? And yeah, if you just don't want to shade because it doesn't suit your art style, you can ignore it, but the reason animation doesn't use a ton of shading is because it's easier to animate without it. Shading is used to create the illusion of depth and volume. I say illusion because obviously a drawing is flat. So you have to trick your eyes using shading to make an image appear 3D. Let's say you want to draw an orange. You obviously would draw a circle. But an orange isn't a circle, it's a sphere, and the way you depict that volume is through shading. But first, cross-contour lines are basically imaginary lines that wrap around the subject you're drawing to show its plane changes. This gives you a helpful guide when trying to figure out where your light and shadows should fall. It can be hard to visualize these lines, so I would suggest starting by tracing a reference first. Yes, I'm giving you permission to trace. It isn't always a bad thing. You're going to follow the curve of your object and imagine that the object is actually transparent. So let the loop you draw around it go all the way around. Think of it like you took a knife and you cut straight through the orange. That's where this loop is gonna go. I'd make at least 2 that cross each other, plus the contour line, which is just the outline. You can add even more to add more dimension. By now you should be able to remove your reference and still be able to tell that the thing you're trying to draw is 3D and it's not just a flat circle. Moving on. So color blocking and value blocking are not the same thing. In fact, we're gonna pretend like our reference doesn't even have a color. Or better yet, we're gonna add a desaturation filter and up the contrast so it actually doesn't have color. The way to do this is gonna be a bit different depending on the application you're using, but you should be able to find an option that says desaturation or something similar in the filters tab. The reason we want to do this is so we can focus on the values of the shadows and highlights rather than simultaneously worrying about color. Value is just the lightness or darkness of a color, so taking away the hue and just using black and white makes the value more clear. This is for learning purposes and it isn't a necessary step every time you want to draw something. It's just better, in my opinion, to understand how values work in black and white before anything else. So you're going to want to block in the shapes that your shadows in your reference are making. Now I'm going to simplify this a bit, and you can too, because my goal isn't to make anything hyper realistic. If that is your goal, then just break down the different value shifts even more. Get as specific as you need to. I'm focusing on 3 main values: the highlights, the shadows, and the base color. Now, I'm only going to do a rough outline of these different sections for now because I want to go over something else before filling everything in. There's a lot of different ways you could shade something, but there are 3 main ones. Those are blending, cell shading, and hatching. Let's start with cell shading. Cell shading uses solid patches of color to block in where shadows and highlights are at. This is most commonly seen in cartoons or anime where cell shading, or even no shading at all, is preferred because it's much simpler to animate. This gives off a sharp, clean look. Blending is pretty self-explanatory. You start by cell shading and then you blend the colors together, either completely or partially. This gives off a soft, almost fuzzy look. I personally like combining the two methods, leaving some portions sharp and others blended. This is closer to how shading in the real world works. Then there's hatching. You've probably seen this style of shading in comics. There are several different ways to use hatching, the main ones being hatching and cross-hatching. Hatching is just shading using unblended lines. The closer the lines are, or the more they overlap, the darker the value, and the more sparse the lines, the lighter. You could also use the direction of the hatching to indicate the direction of the plane being shaded. You could even curve the hatching, which is actually contour shading. Personally, I think combining shading techniques is the best thing to do, but I would encourage you to test all these methods out and see what works best for you. This can actually have a big impact on your style, so have that in mind when you're figuring out which you prefer. Or you could even do some research into more methods of shading because there's a lot. Now I'm gonna go a little off script here because I didn't know how to type this, so this is gonna get a little rambly, but I want to talk about what all these different things are called. Like, what is this? Why is there light here? What is this? What is this? But in hindsight, the reference that I used here is not the best reference for this, so I'm actually going to show you an example that someone else did. I don't know who did this because it's the first thing that showed up on Google, so I'm sorry, I don't know whose this is. I stole your sphere. I'm sorry. But anyways, I actually labeled this because this has some things that my reference is missing. And the main thing is the core shadow, and also this cast shadow is kind of missing. There's a little bit of it in my reference, but it's not a very good one. I think the reason that this happened is because the lighting that was done for this orange was probably done in a way to diffuse as much contrast as possible so you can just see like the vibrance of the orange, but that's not useful for me when I'm trying to draw it and show a lot of contrast. It is useful for the photographer who's trying to make this orange look bright and vibrant and yummy, I guess. I don't know. This right here is reflective light. It's the same thing that I added right here. I don't mean to shame anyone for just not knowing, but I have had people confused and telling me there's not supposed to be light here. That's where the shadow goes. Yes, but no. Now, you would assume there shouldn't be light right here because would this not be the darkest part of the sphere? The reason we have reflective light is because when light comes from the light source, and you can see it's going kind of in this direction, when this light hits the surface of whatever our object is sitting on, usually like a table or something, it's gonna hit and then it's gonna bounce. Because light isn't usually just absorbed into whatever it's hitting. So it's gonna hit the table or whatever surface and it's gonna bounce and it's gonna reflect back onto our sphere. You can test this in real life by taking a dark object, placing it on a light colored table, and you're gonna see the color of the table reflected up onto that object. It's easier to notice with shinier objects, maybe like a soda can or something, but it really happens with everything. So that's what reflective light is. That's this little ring of light that's gonna follow along here. You'll see a big difference between these is that the darkest shadow on this orange, because of the lighting, it's actually right here. But the darkest part of this shadow is actually right here. It's closer to the middle of the sphere than the very edge. The very edge is where the reflective light is on this one. This is mostly because it only has one light source, and this might have two light sources, or there's some extra reflective light. But when there's only one light source, this is gonna end up being darker than this because there's a reflective light here. But the very darkest place is actually right here, which is the occlusion shadow. We don't really get a cast shadow at all for this orange. It could have also just been like edited out, I don't know. But usually when light is shining on something, the light can't go through the object unless it's glass or plastic or something transparent. So the light shining down like this is gonna go around your object and it's gonna leave a shadow, and that's your cast shadow. And you can see the cast shadow, the further away from the sphere it gets, the lighter and more feathery, softer looking it gets more blended, and then when it gets closer to the sphere, it gets sharper and darker. And this, where it touches the sphere, that should be the darkest part of your drawing, because no light should be going here. This is the only time you're probably gonna go completely black, and even then you might not want to go completely black, at least when you start using colors. Maybe for just black and white you could go completely black. And this right here, the highlight, there wasn't really any highlights, any strong highlights on this orange. There wasn't like any like super strong highlight. There's this, which is just the normal light, which is what this is right here on this example. But this highlight, usually you'll have a highlight like this for something that's really shiny, maybe something made of glass, or something that's maybe a really reflective surface, maybe a pearl, something like that, I don't know, metal. You would have a highlight. Or you could just kind of exaggerate and add highlights to things that might not normally have a really strong highlight. I like to do that just to make things look shiny, but that's the result you're gonna get. You're gonna make things look shiny and reflective. Oh, and then you have the mid-tone, which is what, if you're using color, I would call your base color. That's like the actual color of the sphere you're coloring. And then it's going to be a different darker color for the shadow, and a different lighter color for the light, and an even lighter color, maybe even white, for the highlight. But yeah, your mid-tone is also your base color. It's just called mid-tone here because we're just using black and white, so base color doesn't really make sense. Anyways, that's all I have for now. Next I'm going to try and explain color theory. Maybe. I don't know. We'll see. Okay, bye.
You are facing right fucking now. You are facing out of my car. I'm facing a fucking moron. Get out! No! You're facing now! You have no right to scream at me.